Hey, good morning there, my people of this nation. Wake up, get ready, get motivated, stand up, stand strong, stand proud. My name is Alwyn Doolan. I'm a Gurang Waka Waka man from Queensland.
The Australian government, you are on notice.
My message is about how we implement pre-colonisation law, which is Aboriginal law, into a modern day society which we have today. I'm here now in Townsville, Mount Desert Casino, Bellingen, South Coast. I'm here now crossing over the Victorian and New South Wales state border. Come on people, I've been walking for 10 months now. This is about how we move forward together. We want to show you the lands and the livings of how we survived for over 100,000 years. Because you are a part of us now. You are a part of this land. Coming at you, Canberra.
The island of Australia has an indigenous population that traces its history on the continent back some 50,000 years and is recognized as one of the oldest living cultures on the planet. British Captain James Cook arrived on Australian shores in 1770. His cohorts described the land as uninhabitable, despite the fact that an estimated 700,000 people were already living there. The absence of people on the continent is a lie that has woven itself through the tapestry of Australian history, popping up as recently as 2014, when former Prime Minister Tony Abbott described Australia as unsettled before British ships arrived. Australia is the only country in the Commonwealth that doesn't have a treaty. It has never entered into negotiations with indigenous people about the taking of their lands or their place in the new nation. And yet, the idea of a treaty in Australia goes back many years. In 1832, the governor of Van Diemen's Island remarked that it was a fatal error that a treaty was not entered into with the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. Initially, the British afforded very little recognition of Aboriginal customs and laws. In 1840, all governors in Australia and New Zealand were directed that all Aboriginal custom law was to be superseded by British law. Why would a treaty between the British colonial government and the Aboriginal people be important? A treaty could provide, among other things, a symbolic recognition of indigenous sovereignty and prior occupation of this land, a redefinition and restructuring of the relationship between indigenous people and wider Australia, a better protection of indigenous rights, a basis for regional self-government, guidelines for local or regional treaties, structures and systems for local and regional decision-making processes. The subsequent colonization of Australia brought about new diseases and widespread violence, which resulted from racism and oppressive land policies. This devastated many traditional societies, and now Aboriginal people make up only 3% of the Australian population. We have witnessed the extinction of over 25% of the Aboriginal languages, and the remaining 75% is at risk of going extinct in the near future. Up until a couple decades ago, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people faced extreme racism and government encroachment on their territories. It was up until 1962 where the Commonwealth Election Act was amended, thus allowing Indigenous Australians an opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to enroll to vote at federal elections. And it wasn't until 5 years later, in 1967, where a referendum was held in which Australians voted overwhelmingly to amend the constitution to allow the Commonwealth to make laws for the Aboriginal people and include them in the census, thus recognizing them as citizens.
When do Indigenous people get a social, cultural and economic empowerment and voice in Parliament? We're asking to deconstruct the systems that exist. We're asking to be invited to the table. I don't know how you bridge the gap in terms of Aboriginal people are still struggling to have a voice. We are the sovereign owners of this country. I am a Wongatha Yamaji Nunga Gidja. We have never ceded sovereignty. I am tired of begging and asking for our humanity. When is it enough? We share sovereignty with the Crown. The Queen still owns some of our traditional lands. We're still begging to protect sacred sites that are over 80,000 years old from mining companies, from gas companies. We want to be the author of our own destinies. We want to be the voice because we are tired of non-Indigenous Australia thinking they know what is good for us and thinking that they can be the voice for Aboriginal Australia.
In June 2010, a Gomilorai elder, Leal Munro, was fighting the sale of a cultural site in Munro, New South Wales. The site was recognized as Aboriginal land and was an Aboriginal burial ground. Nevertheless, the New South Wales government approved the sale of the land to a retail giant. New South Wales is the only state territory that hasn't enacted separate legislation for the protection of Aboriginal culture and heritage. Mining interests has often collided with Aboriginal land interests ever since Australia's discovery of rich natural resources. Often, political decisions have not been driven by the best interests of the Aboriginal people, but revenue generated by the resource industry. In 1977, an Act of Parliament allowed mining to go ahead on the lands of the Mirarr people, northwest of the Northern Territory, without the express consent, despite the same act giving a right of veto to most of the nations under the Aboriginal groups. Extractor Mount Isa mines were fined $80,000 after they pleaded guilty to damaging an Aboriginal cultural heritage site. They had bulldozed the cultural heritage site and in the process destroyed artifacts which were held sacred by the Aboriginal people in the endeavor to upgrade a road. Various colonial governments implemented a range of different policies relating to the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from the earliest period of colonization. The colonial governments expanded the occupation under the assumed right to do so, with little or no regard for Indigenous Australians. Some of the outcomes of this increasing occupation were displacement, exclusion, diseases, massacres, and violence, which had a devastating effect on the Aboriginal people. The Australian Association of Social Workers has acknowledged the role that social workers and the social work profession played in the implementation of government policies such as the assimilation policies, which led to the stolen generations. In 2004, the AASW published an acknowledgement statement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which acknowledged the role of non-Indigenous social workers in contributing to the stolen generations. This document specifically outlines the role that some social workers played as agents and enactors of government policies, values and norms of that time, and how this was completely contrary to the values and ethics of social work as a profession in terms of the respect of persons, human rights, social justice, self-determination, etc. Reconciliation action plans have been made between the Aboriginal people and the wider Australian society. These have been carried out with the aim of raising awareness on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' way of knowing, being, and doing. Through an awareness of these ways of living, the social work practice shifts from being primarily informed by the dominant Western ways of knowing to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's way of knowing, which assists in effective practice. The role of social work in the reconciliation process is important in addressing divisions and inequalities between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other non-Indigenous Australians. The Australian Association of Social Work is committed to the process of reconciliation with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Social workers acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the first Australians whose lands, winds and waters we all now share, and pay respect to their unique values and the continuing and enduring cultures which deepen and enrich the life of our nation and communities. Social workers commit to acknowledge and understand the historical and contemporary disadvantage experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the implications this has for social work practice. Social workers acknowledge the strengths, capacities, abilities, and contributions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples make to the wider society. It is important that social workers be responsible for ensuring that the practice is culturally responsive, safe, and sensitive.